When your own child tells you not to come for Christmas, something inside you cracks in a way that never fully returns to its old shape. I remember staring at that message, feeling years of sacrifice collapse into one cold dismissal. It was not just rejection, it was erasure. And behind those words hid a truth far darker than I ever imagined, one that would unravel my world, expose a betrayal unfolding right under my roof, and force me to choose between silence and finally standing up for myself. That moment was the line where everything changed forever. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you have not already, do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let us begin. My name is Margaret Whitaker, though most people in my life have always called me Marge. At 68, I had imagined my days after retirement would be quieter, softer, filled with small comforts earned from a lifetime of work. Instead, I found myself beginning again in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Portland, Maine, the kind of place that smelled faintly of old radiators and sea wind drifting in from Fore River. I would sit by the window each morning, listen to the distant horns of the harbor ferries, and try to convince myself that starting over at my age was not something to be ashamed of. Some days that felt true. Other days, it felt like a lie I repeated to keep my heart steady. Before this apartment, there had been Whitaker House, the home where I raised my son Daniel. The home where I painted the walls 3 times because he loved blue, then green, then blue again. A 3-bedroom salt box style house in Falmouth, Maine, with weathered shingles and a yard full of maple leaves every fall. That house had carried my entire adulthood within its walls. I could close my eyes and still feel the uneven wooden floors beneath my bare feet, still see the grooves on the kitchen counter where I used to chop vegetables after 16-hour nursing shifts. Every corner held a memory. Daniel's first steps, the Christmas mornings, the nights I stayed awake sewing patches onto his worn jackets because money had been too tight for new ones. It was not simply a building. It was an anchor. Daniel was my only child, the single bright point in those years when I worked as a public hospital nurse. The job demanded nearly everything from me. Holidays spent in surgical wings, double shifts that left me with aching joints, long nights pushing my limits because patients needed me. But I never complained. Raising Daniel alone after his father left meant I had to be both nurse and mother, provider and comfort. When he grew older, studied engineering, and began his adult life, I believed the hardest years were behind us. Then came Vanessa Reed, the woman he married. She was polished, charismatic, always impeccably dressed, but her eyes never softened when she looked at me. I sensed early on that she kept herself at a distance. Still, for Daniel's sake, I received her with the generosity every mother hopes to offer a new daughter-in-law. Everything began to unravel the day Daniel called, voice trembling, telling me the house was on the brink of foreclosure. I remember gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, staring at the stack of old bills on my table, and realizing the only real asset I had left was the very home that held my lifetime of memories. Selling it felt like cutting away a part of myself, yet I did not hesitate. A mother's instinct is always to protect. I sold Whitaker House, packed 4 decades of my life into cardboard boxes, handed over $420,000, and watched Daniel cry against my shoulder. Behind him, Vanessa offered only a small, emotionless nod. I settled into the apartment soon after, telling myself it would only be temporary. I waited for calls that never came and messages that never appeared. The quiet stretched into weeks. Then, one winter evening, As I sat by the window listening to the wind sweep across the parking lot, my phone lit up. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I felt my breath catch. I tapped the screen. And there it was, a single message, a few cold words that would change everything. If you're still watching and this story is pulling you in, comment number 1 below so I know you're right here with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. You will not believe what happens next. The moment I opened Daniel's message, the quiet of my apartment seemed to collapse inward. The room was dim, lit only by the small lamp beside my recliner, and in that pale cone of light the words on my screen felt unreal. Daniel wrote that I should not come for Christmas, that Vanessa did not want me there, and that she decided everything in their home. I stared at the sentence until the letters blurred. For a breathless moment, I wondered if I had misread it, if my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, if my son would never speak to me in such a dismissive, icy manner. But the truth did not change no matter how many times I looked. A hollow ache spread through my chest. I had known loneliness in life, yet nothing had prepared me for the sting of being dismissed by the child I had raised, the child for whom I had given up my home only months earlier. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself that Daniel was overwhelmed or had been pressured somehow, but the explanations felt thin and desperate. I thought of all the winters before this one, when the living room of Whitaker House glowed with warm lights, when Daniel would sit at the kitchen table cracking jokes while I baked cinnamon rolls. How distant those moments felt now, like memories belonging to someone else. I called him, even knowing the chances were slim. The ringtone echoed through the room, then clicked into silence. I left a message with a calm voice I did not feel, asking him to call me back. Minutes passed. I tried again. More silence. By the time midnight settled over the apartment, I had stopped hoping for a response, yet I kept my phone close, the screen lighting my face each time I checked it. Sleep never came. The next morning, Ruth Alvarez knocked on my door. She had seen my light on through the thin curtains during the early hours and came by with her usual sharp intuition. Ruth, with her steel gray hair and steady posture, had always been the kind of woman who noticed things. When she asked what was wrong, I handed her the phone without a word. She read the message with a narrowing gaze, then looked at me with a seriousness I rarely saw. She told me something was off, something that could not be ignored. Ruth spoke with the practical confidence of a woman who had spent decades working in a law office. She pointed out that gratitude for a life-altering financial rescue should never transform into exclusion, and certainly not so abruptly. She reminded me of small incidents I had mentioned before, comments from Vanessa that hinted at her desire for control. The pieces, Ruth said, were beginning to align in a troubling pattern. I wanted to defend Daniel, to believe he was simply overwhelmed, but even I could not explain the silence that followed my calls. Ruth mentioned that she knew a private investigator named Cole Benson. She said he was discreet, experienced, and capable of uncovering truths that people hid behind polite smiles. I held the business card she offered, studying the embossed letters as if they might burn my fingers. The idea of having someone investigate my own family felt like a betrayal, yet the message from Daniel replayed in my mind, colder each time. I spent the afternoon in quiet turmoil. My thoughts churned with guilt, worry, fear, and an unfamiliar anger. I had always believed that love and patience could mend anything, but perhaps this time required more than a hopeful heart. As evening shadows lengthened, I finally picked up my phone and dialed the number on the card. My voice trembled slightly as I asked for an appointment. After the call ended, I stood by the window. Snow had begun to fall in slow, drifting flakes, settling over the parked cars in a thin white veil. Everything outside looked hushed, waiting. I realized that I too had stopped waiting. I was taking the first step toward understanding what had gone wrong. And though fear lingered in my chest, there was resolve there as well, quiet, steady, and long overdue. If you're still watching and the tension is starting to build for you, drop a number 2 in the comments to let me know you're following along. Now, let's move on to chapter 3, where things take a sharp turn. The days leading up to my meeting with Cole Benson moved slowly, each one stretched thin by unease. I tried to distract myself with small routines inside my apartment, but nothing held my focus for long. The quiet felt too heavy, and every time my phone lit up, my heart jumped with hope before sinking again. Daniel still had not called. I replayed his message endlessly, trying to understand how the son I raised could speak to me with such finality. I wondered if I had missed signs over the last few years, moments when Vanessa's influence had begun to shape the distance growing between us. The more I thought about it, the more fear threaded itself through my chest. When the morning of the appointment arrived, Minneapolis was wrapped in a pale winter haze. Snow dusted the sidewalks in thin layers, and my breath drifted in the cold air as I made my way to a small cafe in Midtown where Cole had suggested we meet. The windows glowed warmly, a contrast to the gray sky above. Inside, the scent of roasted coffee beans filled the air. Cole was already there, sitting at a corner table with a neat folder placed beside his cup. He had a calm presence, steady eyes, and the posture of someone who had delivered bad news more than once. I sat across from him, my palms damp. He greeted me with professional courtesy before sliding the manila folder toward me. The weight of it felt symbolic, as if everything I feared had been tucked inside its thin walls. He told me he had completed the preliminary round of investigation and that the results were not simple misunderstandings. My pulse quickened as he spoke, each word confirming the dread I had tried so hard to silence. Inside the folder were printed emails between Vanessa and a real estate broker. She had scheduled private calls discussing the market value of my former home, the one I sacrificed everything to save. She asked about discreetly selling it without listing it publicly, and what steps she could take to ensure the money from the sale appeared under her name alone. My stomach twisted. I remember Daniel telling me that Vanessa managed their household finances, and at the time I assumed it was no more than a preference. Now, I saw how deeply she had manipulated that control. Cole then revealed another set of documents. Vanessa had contacted a family law attorney weeks before Daniel ever reached out to me for help, asking about divorce procedures and how to separate assets. The tone of her messages suggested she was planning this carefully, not in response to any crisis, but as part of a larger strategy. But the final envelope made me grip the table. Photographs showed Vanessa meeting repeatedly with a man I did not recognize. They were taken entering upscale restaurants, walking close together, and sharing private conversations in parking lots. Cole explained that the man was a real estate investor and that the meetings had been frequent over the last several months. Each image felt like another blow, not because Vanessa had betrayed Daniel, but because she had used my sacrifice to set the stage for her own plans. I felt something inside me fracture. For a moment I could hardly breathe, my mind swimming through disbelief and sorrow. Yet beneath the shock, a slow-burning anger began to rise. Not wild or uncontrolled, but steady and focused. I thought of Daniel, oblivious to the life being built and destroyed around him. I thought of the lifetime of choices I had made in love and sacrifice, only to be told I was unwelcome in the home I helped save. When Cole asked about the loan document I mentioned, I confirmed that I had the signed agreement and the clause requiring repayment if the property was sold. His expression sharpened, and he told me this gave me significant power. I realized then that I was no longer helpless. The wind outside was picking up when I left the cafe, snow drifting across the street like pale ribbons. I wrapped my coat tightly around myself and walked forward with a sense of clarity I had not felt in years. The truth had broken something open inside me, and now, for the first time, I was ready to act. If you're still watching and feeling the shift in the story, comment number 3 below so I know you're still here. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. This is where the cracks begin to widen. I returned to my apartment with the thick folder still clutched in my hands, its edges pressing into my palms as if to remind me that everything inside was real. The quiet of the room greeted me again, but this time it felt different. It no longer swallowed me. Instead, it sharpened my awareness, pushing me to face what had been unraveling behind my back for so long. I placed the folder on the kitchen table, the same small space where I had once prepared lunches for Daniel when he was a boy, and unfolded every document. The loan agreement sat at the top, my signature, Daniel's signature, the clause I insisted on adding. I traced my finger along the words and felt a surge of clarity rise through the ache. I tried calling Daniel again. The line rang once before dropping into silence. I sent a message asking him to call me. Minutes passed, then hours. The screen showed that the message had been read, yet there was no response. The realization crept in slowly but painfully. He was ignoring me fully and consciously, whether because he did not care or because Vanessa was telling him not to, I did not know, but the hurt settled deep. The next morning, I decided that waiting behind a phone screen was no longer an option. I bundled myself in my thick winter coat and took the long bus ride to the edge of their suburban neighborhood. Their house stood warmly lit against the dull winter sky. I stepped onto the walkway, snow crunching beneath my boots, and rang the bell. I waited, listening. I saw shadows move inside. Someone was there, but no one opened the door. I rang again. Nothing. A curtain shifted slightly, proof that I was seen and still ignored. The cold bit through my gloves, but the sting of rejection was far sharper. A neighbor walking her dog paused near the driveway. She recognized me and hesitated before saying that Vanessa had mentioned I was becoming too involved, that I did not respect boundaries. Hearing that lie repeated through someone else's voice made my stomach twist. I stood there until I felt foolish, then turned away and walked back toward the bus stop with a hollow heaviness settling in my chest. Later that afternoon, Ruth came by with her usual blunt intuition. When I told her what happened, she listened without interruption. Then she explained with calm logic that emotional appeals would not work on someone under influence. She said this was no longer a personal misunderstanding, but a situation shaped by control, manipulation, and legal danger. Her words were firm, but not unkind, and they grounded me more than I expected. That night, I sat at my small kitchen table again and wrote through the tangle of my thoughts. Memories of raising Daniel alone surfaced, not to cause more pain, but to remind me of the strength I had learned in silence. I had faced harder things before. I could face this. The following day, I met with Attorney Harrison. He reviewed every page of the loan agreement with meticulous care, confirming that I had significant legal protection. He explained, however, that confronting Vanessa too soon would backfire. She could twist the situation into claims that I was harassing them, and Daniel might retreat even further into her influence. His warning struck me. Strategy, not emotion, had to guide my next steps. By evening, I made my decision. I would stop reaching out. I would let silence do its work, let them believe I had stepped back. It was not surrender. It was preparation. As I stood by the window watching fresh snow coat the street, my phone buzzed with a message from Cole. He had found something new. I opened the notification, but the details remained unseen for now. I let the suspense settle in my chest, knowing the next step would bring everything closer to the breaking point. If you're still watching and the conflict has you hooked, comment number 4 to tell me you're keeping pace. Now, let's move on to chapter 5, where everything is about to escalate. I barely slept after seeing Cole's message the night before. The few moments when I did drift off were shallow and restless, filled with uneasy images of Daniel trapped behind a locked door that I could not open. By dawn, the city outside my window was covered in a thick blanket of snow, soft and white, in stark contrast to the heavy dread tightening inside my chest. The silence of Minneapolis that morning felt unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I dressed slowly, my movements tense, knowing instinctively that whatever Cole had discovered would not be something I could ignore or soften with hopeful explanations. His office in the warehouse district sat between old brick buildings with frost tracing the window frames. Inside, the space was minimal and coldly lit, the kind of place where truth stood without decoration. Cole greeted me with a seriousness that confirmed my fears before he even spoke. He motioned for me to sit, then placed a new folder on the desk between us. The sight of it made my stomach twist. I braced myself for whatever might be inside. What he showed me first was not something I could have imagined even in my worst fears. Vanessa had applied for a new mortgage loan, using my former home as collateral. The application listed only her name, but the supporting documents included a signature meant to look like Daniel's. The lines were slightly off, too curved in places where Daniel wrote with sharp angles. Cole explained that this was considered fraud, not speculation or misunderstanding. The bank was already reviewing the documents, but if the process moved forward without intervention, both Daniel and the property would be ensnared in a legal disaster far worse than foreclosure. My breath left me in a sharp rush. Betrayal was one thing. Calculated destruction was another. I imagined Daniel, unaware, trusting, believing he was safe while someone he loved undermined every piece of stability left in his life. The thought burned through me, and for a moment I could not speak. My hands trembled slightly as I studied the forged signature again. It felt like looking at a blade pressed against my son's future. Cole continued, his tone grim. The night I had stood outside the house waiting for someone to open the door, Vanessa was meeting her lover at a hotel across town. Photographs captured them entering the lobby, speaking closely in a way that made their intentions unmistakable. They had discussed leaving for Denver as soon as the house was sold and the funds were transferred. They planned to start a new life, abandoning Daniel with the debts and legal consequences he did not deserve. A deep anger rose within me, not wild but precise. It was the anger of a mother who had been pushed aside, ignored, and humiliated, yet who still loved her child enough to fight for him even when he had turned away. The pain of Daniel's silence no longer held me back. It fueled something sharper. This was no longer only about me. This was about protecting the son I raised, the boy who once clung to my hand crossing icy streets, the young man who trusted the wrong person far too deeply. Cole warned me that Vanessa planned to finalize the fraudulent loan within 72 hours. If she succeeded, the house could be lost, and Daniel would be liable for the debt. Time was slipping quickly away. He said Daniel likely had no idea the documents existed, that Vanessa controlled his mail and online accounts. Hearing that made my stomach tighten again, not from anger, but from sorrow for how completely he had been manipulated. When I left Cole's office, the wind cut sharply against my face. Snowflakes clung to my coat as I stood on the sidewalk, gripping the folder so tightly that the edges bent beneath my fingers. Fear coursed through me, but beneath it was something stronger, a resolve I had not felt in years. I could not afford hesitation. I could not afford gentleness. The battle had arrived, and I would not let my son fall without a fight. The cold bit into my skin, but inside, I burned like iron pulled from a fire, shaken, reshaped, but unbreakable. When I returned home from Cole's office, the world outside my window seemed suspended in white silence. Snow drifted in slow spirals, settling over the streetlights and parked cars in soft layers that softened every outline. Inside, however, nothing felt soft. My thoughts pulsed with urgency, twisting and tightening until I could hardly breathe. I set my coat aside and stood still for a long moment, listening to the quiet and feeling the weight of the choice settling over me. Part of me wanted to crawl into bed and let the exhaustion swallow me whole, but I knew there was no space left for retreat. Not with what I had learned, not with the clock running as fast as it was. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I had sorted bills for years and helped Daniel with school projects when he was young. I spread the documents before me once more, even though I knew every painful detail already. The loan agreement I signed with Daniel, the clause requiring full repayment if the house was ever sold, the photographs of Vanessa with the man she was planning to run away with, the forged signature that threatened to entangle Daniel in a financial trap he would never see coming until it collapsed on top of him. Each page felt heavier than paper ought to feel, as if the future itself had been pressed into these thin sheets. Two paths lay before me, each steeped in consequences. I could stay silent, follow Attorney Harrison's advice, and wait for Vanessa to complete her reckless scheme. That path gave me complete legal advantage. She would fall into her own trap, exposed and accountable, but the risk was enormous. Daniel could be tied to a fraudulent loan that would stain his record, drain his finances, or worse. Waiting might protect my position, but it could destroy his life. The other option was to step forward now, before Vanessa finished the paperwork that would lock Daniel into disaster. I could go to him, present the evidence, force the truth into the open. But that came with its own dangers. He might refuse to believe me. He might push me away more fiercely than before. Vanessa could twist the confrontation into claims that I was harassing them or interfering with their marriage. I could lose the fragile legal footing I still had. The conflict inside me felt almost unbearable. The sting of Daniel's cruel message from weeks ago still lingered. The message telling me not to come for Christmas because his wife decided everything. That wound had not closed. Yet the thought of him becoming the victim of a scheme so calculated, so ruthless, was even more painful. My love for him had been bruised, but it had not disappeared. A mother's love did not unravel because of one message, however cold it might have been. As I sat there, my laptop chimed softly. A familiar automated email had slipped through, a fraud alert connected to the old joint notification Daniel and I never fully disconnected years ago. The message referenced unusual account activity. I felt my heart sink. Vanessa was not slowing down. She was accelerating. I called Attorney Harrison for guidance. His tone was measured, thoughtful. He reminded me that acting too soon could hand Vanessa an advantage. But he also told me that once fraudulent actions escalated to this level, silence was no longer protection. It could become liability. His words deepened the heaviness in my chest, but they also clarified something I had been avoiding. Later, in the bathroom, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I saw the softness of age, the lines carved by years of sacrifice, but I also saw resilience. I thought of the obstacles I had survived, of raising a child alone, of building a life with the hands that never stopped working. I realized that the woman staring back at me had never been powerless. She had simply forgotten her own strength. By nightfall, my decision was made. I gathered every document, placed them in a thick folder, and set them near the door. Tomorrow I would meet with Harrison to finalize our plan, then I would go to Daniel. Not in desperation, but with clarity and truth. I would not let him fall, even if he no longer saw me as someone worth trusting. Standing by the window once more, I watched the snow deepen across the city. The hush of winter wrapped the streets, but inside me, a storm had steadied into purpose. I exhaled slowly and rested my hand on the folder. My choice was made, and it would change everything. If you're still watching and feeling the weight of what just happened, comment number 6 below so I know you're staying with the story. Now, let's move into Chapter 7, where consequences finally begin to unfold. The morning of the confrontation arrived wrapped in a cold, heavy quiet. I woke before dawn, my stomach tight with a tension that felt almost physical, as if a weight had settled on my ribs and refused to lift. Snow still drifted outside my window, the flakes small and steady, softening the edges of the world while sharpening the urgency inside me. I dressed carefully, choosing simple, warm clothes, then placed the thick folder of documents into my bag. Every step felt deliberate, as if I were preparing for a battle I never wanted but could no longer avoid. At Attorney Harrison's office, the atmosphere was grave but steady. His desk was covered with neatly arranged files, each one representing another piece of the truth. He went through them one more time, confirming their order, pausing briefly over the loan agreement between Daniel and me. The clause requiring full repayment if the property was sold now felt like a lifeline tied to my son's future. He added the evidence of the forged signature, the email trail showing the secret evaluations of the house, and the photographs Cole had provided. Last, he reviewed the motion for temporary transaction freeze, the legal shield that would stop Vanessa's plan before it reached the bank. When he handed me a pen to sign the motion, my hand shook slightly. I was not intimidated by the legal process, but by what the truth would do to Daniel. I had wanted to protect him from hardship his entire life, yet what I held in my hands would tear open the life he thought he had. Still, I signed the document, the ink soaked into the paper with finality. On the drive to Daniel's home, the city looked as if it were holding its breath. Snowbanks lined the sidewalks like pale walls, and the sky hung low with gray clouds. When we arrived, the street was quiet, the suburban houses standing in orderly rows. A car I did not recognize was parked in front of Daniel's driveway, adding to the dread curling in my chest. Harrison reminded me to stay calm, to let him handle the presentation of evidence. His voice had a grounding quality that steadied my nerves. Daniel answered the door after a moment, his expression marked by confusion and surprise. Behind him, Vanessa appeared almost instantly, her posture rigid, her eyes shifting quickly between Harrison and me. Her face paled at the sight of the folder in my hands. Daniel stepped back hesitantly, allowing us inside, though the air between us felt colder than the weather outside. Harrison opened the folder and laid the documents on the kitchen island one by one. He explained that a fraudulent mortgage application had been filed, using the house as collateral. Vanessa's face tightened with each word, her composure slipping. Daniel stared at the documents, his eyes moving slowly, as if each sentence weighed more than he could bear. The forged signature was placed in front of him, and I watched as realization drained the color from his face. The room seemed to shrink around him. He sank onto a chair, his posture collapsing inward. Vanessa stepped away, her expression calculating and defensive, but there was no room left for denial. She looked exposed, and for the first time uncertain. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel did not look at her. He did not look at me. He stared at the documents as if they had pulled the ground out from under him. My heart ached so deeply that I felt it in my bones. I wanted to reach out, to touch his shoulder, to tell him he was not alone, but the moment was too raw. He needed space to absorb the truth that had been hidden from him for so long. I stood quietly, absorbing the heaviness of the moment. I had saved my son, but the cost of that salvation lay plainly before me, the dismantling of the life he believed in. As the snow continued to fall outside, the three of us remained in a room thick with silent grief, each of us recognizing the permanent shift that had just taken place. The house felt hollow after Attorney Harrison left, as if the walls themselves were trying to absorb the shock of what had unfolded. I watched Daniel sink into the couch, his shoulders collapsing inward, his eyes fixed on a point so far away he might as well have been staring into another lifetime. His breathing was uneven, shallow, as if the truth had knocked the air out of him. I wanted to reach for him, to steady him, but I knew the moment was too fragile for words. A mother can offer comfort, but he cannot rush a son through the breaking of an illusion. Daniel pressed a hand to his forehead, struggling to keep himself together. The weight of betrayal rippled across his expression in the slow, painful waves. The man who had once carried himself with quiet confidence now looked like someone who had been emptied from the inside. He whispered something to himself, barely audible, more a confession to the room than to me. He was blaming himself. I could see it in every tense line of his posture. Shame, guilt, disbelief. They were all crashing into him at once, leaving him unsteady. Vanessa had retreated to their bedroom earlier, the soft thud of the closing door marking her silent surrender. She had not returned. For the first time since she entered our lives, she was not the loudest presence in the house. Her absence was sharper than any argument. It signaled the collapse of the power she used to hold over my son. Even from a distance, I could sense her fear of the legal consequences, fear of losing everything she had tried to steal. Yet, there was no triumph in me, only exhaustion. When Harrison outlined the necessary steps earlier, freezing the assets, documenting the fraudulent signature, initiating separation proceedings, Daniel had listened like a man underwater. The information reached him, but slowly, filtered through the fog of heartbreak. Still, he nodded. He agreed. He had given the lawyer authorization to begin. Even in the midst of despair, he had taken that first step forward. I finally sat beside him, leaving a respectful distance, offering presence rather than pressure. I kept my voice low and steady when I spoke a single sentence, meant only to anchor him, not to advise him. It was enough to let him know he was not alone. He lifted his eyes to me then, the first flicker of something like clarity breaking through the storm inside him. It was faint, but it was there. Later, after Harrison left, the house returned to its stunned quiet. Daniel remained on the couch, his gaze softer now, no longer scattered. I walked to the front porch and watched the early winter snowfall thicken over the yard. The cold air bit at my face, steadying my thoughts. A long road waited for us. Legal battles, emotional recovery, rebuilding trust. But at least the shadows had been cleared. The truth, painful as it was, had finally surfaced. And now, for the first time in a long while, we could face it together. If you're still watching and sensing the shift toward resolution, comment number 8 below to let me know you're still here. Now, let's head into the final chapters to see how everything comes together. In the days that followed, the house settled into a quiet that felt almost unfamiliar. The tension that had once clung to every room had lifted, replaced by an atmosphere that was unexpectedly calm. Daniel spent his morning sorting through stacks of paperwork that had piled up during the chaos, filing documents, answering calls from attorney Harrison, and slowly piecing his life back together. I watched him move with a steadiness I had not seen in months. His shoulders were still heavy, but no longer collapsing inward. There was effort in every step he took, yet also intention. Vanessa left 2 days after the confrontation. She packed her belongings in silence and never looking either of us in the eye. The slam of the trunk closing was the only final word she offered before driving away. I stood by the window and watched without bitterness. The anger had long burned itself out. What remained was a quiet acceptance that her departure was not a punishment, but simply the ending that had always been waiting beneath her choices. The legal process moved forward quickly. With evidence of falsified documents and financial manipulation, her role in the matter became clear. Daniel met with Harrison several times, signing forms for the divorce, cooperating fully with the investigation. Each meeting seemed to straighten his posture a little more, as if every signature removed another thread of the web he had been trapped in. Our relationship changed in small, steady ways. Daniel began joining me in the kitchen while I cooked, sometimes chopping vegetables, sometimes just sitting nearby in silence. We took evening walks through the neighborhood in the cold winter air. He asked my opinion more often, not out of dependence, but out of genuine respect. It felt like rediscovering a part of my son that had been overshadowed for years. One night, as we shared a simple dinner of roasted chicken and potatoes, Daniel paused and looked across the table at me. He did not need to speak for me to understand. Gratitude does not always require words. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a sense of peace I had not known in a long time. The house glowed softly against the early evening sky, and for the first time in months, it felt like a home again. When winter came around again, I found myself standing at the same kitchen window where, a year earlier, I had felt the sharp sting of being pushed out of my own son's life. The memory of that cold message still drifted through my mind, but it no longer carried the weight it once did. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a long, winding road that had led me back to myself. I remembered the confusion, the humiliation, the sense that I had been erased. Yet now, looking back, those moments felt like necessary fractures in the old version of my life. I thought about the moment I chose to stop accepting the role of an invisible father. I remembered walking into Attorney Harrison's office, a place that had seemed intimidating at first, but later became a reminder that I still had power. Taking action did not come naturally to me. For most of my life, I had been someone who avoided conflict, who gave more than he received, who trusted too easily. But age had not weakened me. If anything, it had sharpened my understanding of what needed to be protected. Daniel's transformation was perhaps the most unexpected part of this journey. Watching him rediscover clarity, accountability, and a sense of grounding brought a quiet pride I could not fully put into words. He had made mistakes, painful ones, but he had chosen to confront them rather than hide behind excuses. Seeing him approach life with renewed honesty reminded me that growth can appear even in the aftermath of betrayal. I reflected, too, on Vanessa's deception. The hurt she caused had been deep, but what remained now was not bitterness. It was simply recognition of truth. Betrayal often comes from the people we let closest, but that does not make the betrayal our fault. It only reveals the character of the one who commits it. As the evening settled in, Daniel and I sat down for dinner, a simple meal we had cooked together. The glow from the kitchen lights cast a warm circle around us, and the house no longer felt like a place where battles were fought. It felt like a place where healing had taken root. I realized then that the greatest victory was not in exposing lies or winning legal battles. It was reclaiming my dignity, my voice, and my relationship with my son. In the end, I found peace not because life became perfect, but because I chose to honor myself again. And that choice, I learned, is where true freedom begins. In the quiet, after any storm, there comes a moment when a person finally sees the truth of their journey. Betrayal, no matter how deeply it cuts, does not have the final word. What defines the ending is the courage to reclaim dignity, the strength to rise again, and the wisdom to draw boundaries without letting bitterness harden the heart. Healing rarely arrives in grand gestures. It shows up in small choices, choosing clarity over confusion, peace over chaos, and self-respect over silent suffering. Life has a way of teaching us that even painful endings can lead to beginnings shaped by honesty, resilience, and renewed purpose. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If it touched you, inspired you, or made you reflect on your own strength, please share your thoughts in the comments. Do not forget to follow and subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart.